Ötzi the Iceman had bigger problems than an arrow. When Ötzi the Iceman was discovered frozen in the Alps in 1991, it looked at first like a straightforward ancient murder case. A man from over 5,000 years ago, preserved almost perfectly in ice, with an arrow lodged in his shoulder. For years, that single detail shaped the entire narrative. It seemed simple. He was shot, he bled out, and the cold preserved his final moment. But modern forensic science, CT scans, and DNA analysis have completely changed that story. The more researchers study him, the clearer it becomes that the arrow was not even close to his biggest problem. In fact, it may have been just one part of a much more complicated and violent final sequence. Ötzi lived around 3300 BC during the late Neolithic period, a time when early farming communities were spreading across Europe and social groups were becoming more complex. He was not just a random traveler in the mountains. His clothing, tools, and preserved belongings suggest someone who was experienced, prepared, and likely familiar with survival in harsh environments. He carried a copper axe, a finely crafted weapon that alone suggests a certain status, or at least access to valuable resources. One of the most important discoveries came from high-resolution imaging of his body. While the arrowhead in his shoulder initially seemed like the cause of death, further analysis showed that the wound alone was not immediately fatal. The arrow likely severed an artery, but not in a way that caused instant death. That means Ötzi could still have been conscious, moving, and attempting to survive for some time after being shot. This completely changes the narrative from a sudden killing to a prolonged and stressful final struggle. Even more surprising is what CT scans revealed about his brain and internal injuries. There is evidence of trauma to his head, including a blow that may have occurred shortly before or shortly after the arrow injury. This suggests he may have been involved in close combat or attacked by multiple individuals. In other words, the arrow was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger confrontation. Copper Age Europe. During the Copper Age, violence between small communities was not uncommon. Resources, land, and trade routes were becoming increasingly important, and conflict often escalated quickly. Ötzi's injuries fit into this broader pattern. His body shows not only the arrow wound, but also cuts on his hands and abrasions consistent with defensive movement. These are not the marks of someone simply caught by surprise. They suggest active struggle, possibly hand-to-hand combat before or after the arrow was fired. DNA analysis added another layer of complexity. For a long time, researchers assumed Ötzi was a healthy individual who died suddenly. But genetic studies revealed that he carried markers associated with cardiovascular disease. Specifically, evidence suggests he may have had early signs of arterial calcification. This means that even if he had survived the attack, his long-term health may already have been compromised. In other words, his body was not in perfect condition even before the violent encounter took place. This changes how we understand his vulnerability. Instead of a strong individual taken down by a single lucky shot, we may be looking at someone who was already biologically stressed, possibly fatigued, and operating under difficult physical conditions in high-altitude terrain. The arrow becomes part of a chain of disadvantages rather than the sole cause of death. Another major discovery came from the contents of his stomach. Unlike early assumptions that he died immediately after being attacked, analysis of his last meals shows that he ate multiple times in the hours before his death. His stomach contained partially digested meat and grains, indicating he survived for several hours after his final meal. This directly contradicts the idea of instant death and supports a scenario where he was moving, possibly fleeing or hiding, while injured. Even more interesting is the pollen found in his digestive system and clothing. It suggests he was traveling through different elevation zones shortly before his death, meaning he was not stationary. He was on the move, likely aware of danger, and possibly attempting to escape or reach safety. This paints a picture of a man in motion, not a victim struck and immediately frozen in place. CT scans of his body also revealed the position of the arrow more precisely than earlier examinations. The arrowhead was lodged deep enough to damage tissue, but not in a way that caused immediate collapse. What likely made the injury fatal was internal bleeding combined with exposure to cold and stress. In alpine environments, even moderate injuries can become deadly if movement continues and blood loss is not controlled. This means the environment itself played a major role in his death. Alps. The Alps, where Ötzi was found, are not a passive backdrop. They are a harsh environment where temperature drops, weather shifts rapidly, and survival depends on constant adaptation. If Ötzi was injured and attempting to move through this terrain, his chances of survival would have decreased quickly even without additional attacks. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and blood loss together create a combination that modern medicine recognizes as extremely dangerous even today. Another layer of mystery comes from the artifacts found with him. His copper axe, bow, arrows, and carefully prepared clothing suggest he was not unprepared or careless. In fact, his equipment was advanced for his time. This raises an important question. If he was skilled and prepared, what kind of situation could overwhelm him so completely? The answer likely lies in coordinated human conflict rather than a random encounter. Some researchers now believe Ötzi may have been involved in a larger social or territorial dispute. The presence of multiple injuries and the possibility of pursuit suggest he was not alone in his final moments. There are even theories that he may have been fleeing after an earlier conflict when he was struck by the arrow. This would explain why he was found in a remote, high-altitude location rather than a settlement. DNA analysis of the bacteria preserved in his body has also revealed signs of infection. One of the most interesting findings is evidence of stomach bacteria linked to disease-causing organisms. This suggests he may have been dealing with chronic health issues even before the attack. Combined with arterial disease, physical trauma, and environmental exposure, his body was under multiple stress factors simultaneously. The more science examines Ötzi, the less his death looks like a single moment and the more it appears to be a chain reaction. Injury led to weakness, weakness led to slower movement, and slower movement made exposure and blood loss more dangerous. The arrow may have initiated the sequence, but it did not act alone. Even the final position of his body adds to the mystery. He was found lying face down, with his arm extended and his belongings still nearby. This suggests he did not survive long enough after reaching his final resting place to rearrange anything or seek shelter. But the lack of panic positioning also suggests a gradual collapse rather than instant death. What modern forensic science ultimately reveals is that Ötzi's story is not about a single dramatic moment. It is about accumulation, small injuries, environmental pressure, pre-existing health conditions, and human conflict all combined into a situation where survival became impossible. The arrow in his shoulder is still important, but it is no longer the headline. It is just one part of a much larger sequence of events that unfolded in real time thousands of years ago. And perhaps the most striking realization is that Ötzi was not simply a victim of violence or nature alone. He was caught at the intersection of both, where human conflict and natural environment worked together in a way that ultimately sealed his fate.